what then? What would be the possibilities? I think it would be saving a lot more people. But given our narrowness, all we can say to people is, given what we know, you got so much to live. The trouble is, we don't know a whole lot. But we don't know that we don't know a whole lot. The problem with the medical profession is not that it doesn't know everything, but that it thinks that what it doesn't know is not worth knowing.
That's profound, too. That's true.
And so we ignore everything else. So all the wisdom of the ages, the other medical practices from around the world, the influence of the mind, all these things we don't pay attention to because we just don't think there's anything there for us.
Can we talk a little bit about Stephen Hawking? Because you mentioned him in the book and you shared a bit about his life and his imprinting in his early childhood with his parents. Do you feel comfortable?
But everybody with ALS, when you look at anybody with ALS, it doesn't matter who it is, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or in North America, Lou Gehrig's disease, the template for that is Lou Gehrig himself, who was the son of an alcoholic father, who learned very early to suppress his needs in order to support his mother emotionally, and his father, and therefore who never said no, and therefore set a record for consecutive games played as a New York Yankee, because he never missed a game, even when his hands were fractured, as they were 17 times. But he continued to play. Then he develops ALS, and the typical ALS personality is somebody with severe emotional loss in childhood, inability to say no, taken on way too much, and refuses to ask for help. And in Stephen Hawking's case, he comes from an emotionally very arid family. The father was emotionally and physically very often absent. The family would have very little emotional contact. They'd sit around the dinner table, each of them buried in their own newspapers, very much in the intellectual mind, but no emotional expression. And typically when he's diagnosed, he's falling and hurting himself, and he's not telling anybody. But people with ALS don't ask for help. I think what enabled him to survive was that being a brilliant intellect, he could really live a life of the mind. He didn't have to give up his self-image in order to deal with the disease. Like if he had been a marathon runner, I don't think he'd be alive today. But he could actually express himself very strongly to his mind. That's the first thing. The second thing is he developed to be not such a nice guy. If you bother him, he'll run over your foot with his wheelchair, so I'm told. So he developed this capacity to express anger. And thirdly, he said women in his life who actually took over his stresses. His first wife became almost a suicidal shell of herself because she completely emptied herself looking after him, at which point he leaves her and marries his nurse. And I think all that helped him survive.
Now, you're talking about Lou Gehrig, or you're talking about...
No, I'm talking about Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking now, yeah, that's
Lou
what
Gehrig
I
didn't
thought.
survive. Lou Gehrig remained a nice guy to the end, until he could no longer drive himself around or drag himself around the baseball diamond, and he died shortly after.
You have gotten an outstanding alumnus award from Simon Fraser University, and are you still an adjunct professor in SFU's School of Criminology?
Well, I was appointed to that just this year.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that actually means. First of all, it means I don't get paid. That's what it means. But that's okay. Yeah, they'll want me to do some lecturing up there. I mean, I'm not a criminologist, but I think they believe that my work on addiction, which is another book of mine, is an important contribution to understanding criminal behavior, which I can't disagree with them either. So they appointed me adjunct professor. And
how has Canada received you?
Well, my books all four of them are bestsellers up here. So in Canada, I've sold, in the four of them, I've sold about 400 or 200,000 books, which in the U.S. context would translate to about 3 million books. But they've been national bestsellers up here. I no longer work as a physician. I dropped my license just this year. I'm just too busy fielding invitations to speak and to teach, which is what I do now, both in the U.S. and Canada. So the response has been more than gratifying, and pretty much whenever everybody reads my work, or anybody reads my work where they hear about it in an interview, there's a tremendous excitement about it. In Canada, I have had more coverage in the mainstream media than I've had in the States. But in the States, where people do hear about me, or the work that I do or the ideas that I present, it's not about me personally, there's a terrific amount of interest and enthusiasm. Because I actually think that I'm speaking to people's experience. I mean, am I saying anything to you that on the gut level doesn't seem right to you?
Not at all.
Yeah, well, that's just the whole thing. So people do experience this. What I do, and thanks to my medical training and capacity to articulate ideas, I provide an intellectual framework and analysis for people's experience. But people know this stuff in their guts. And very often the problem with doctors and the patients is the patient's guts are telling them one thing and the doctor's telling them another. And in our society, we tend not to pay attention to our gut feelings.
And the gut actually has a brain, doesn't it?
Well, the gut has been called the second brain because the gut is a huge nervous system. It's got many, many nerve centers, and it sends many, many nerve fibers to the brain with all kinds of information. Many more nerve fibers go from the gut to the brain than come down the other way. In other words, the gut is speaking to the brain, and the brain is speaking to the gut. The two can't be separated, as a matter of fact. So gut feelings are crucial sensory information for us. When our gut feelings are acting up, they're telling us to really be careful about something and to pay attention to something. And most people have had the experience that to ignore a gut feeling is to bring some kind of a problem upon your head. The gut is a very intelligent sensory organ.
Wouldn't it be great if people learned how to tune in to their gut brain?
There's a large number of people who do. Do you know what we call those people?
Shamans?
No, there's a much larger group than that. Infants.
That's great.
We're all born with that capacity. In fact, that's what we were born with. Have you ever met a one-day-old that doesn't express his gut feelings?
No.
You know, in other words, it's nothing that we have to learn. What we have to learn is what's in the way of it, because it's there, right? That's part of our nature. That's who we are. So it's the loss of contact with our gut feelings that's unnatural. And what we have to figure out is not how to pay attention, but what's in the way of us paying attention.
Do you think that it's socially stamped out of us through mechanized activity, through habit, through being busy, through not being present to the now?
Well, all that is true. But the template for all that is our early experience in our families of origin. When our parents know how to recognize and validate our gut feelings, then we learn to recognize and validate them too. And then we don't lose touch with them. When our parents are too stressed, distracted, depressed, otherwise occupied, or reactive, then we suppress our awareness of gut feelings because we don't want conflict with our environment. So it is socially induced, but the things you mentioned, though totally valid, and they keep us that way, they're secondary to the original loss, which happens in the family of origin.
I know that you wrote also extensively about early childhood adversity and impacts how you live and is imprinted in your brain and in your behavior. Can you explain it?
Sure. The Buddha said that with our minds we create the world. With our thoughts we create the world. In other words, how we see the world is the world we're going to live in. So if you see the world as a hostile place where nobody can be trusted, you're going to have a very different experience from the world than if you think that the world actually is basically people are good, people are well-meaning, you have to be careful, because not everybody is, but fundamentally, you can find help in this world if you know how to look for it. Now, you're going to live in a very different world if you have one belief or the other, right?
Yes.
Each of those beliefs are inculcated in us through our early experiences. So if a child is not picked up when they cry, if the parent is too stressed or depressed to pay attention to the child's emotional dynamics and emotional messages, if the parent is abusive, then the child will learn that the world is an unsafe place where he or she is all alone and nobody can be trusted and they have to do everything for themselves, and if they don't control everything, everything will fall apart.
As a meta message, right?
That's the message, and that's what they're going to then project into the world, as opposed to a child who's listened to and honored and held and so on. They'll have a very different world. So these fundamental experiences become translated into unconscious beliefs that we have about the world. And it's those unconscious beliefs then that regulate our behavior. So the person who believes that they're not worthy will find relationships in which their unworthiness is constantly proven to them.